My son accidentally sent me a voice message meant for his wife. We're signing the papers on Friday. I found out their plan for me and my house. The surprise I prepared for them made them in court. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Calloway, and I have lived in the same house on Birchwood Lane for 41 years. I want you to understand what that house meant to me before I tell you what happened. My late husband, Gerald, and I bought it in 1983 for $82,000. We painted every room ourselves. We planted the oak tree in the backyard the summer our son, Marcus, was born. I raised that boy in those walls. I watched him take his first steps on those hardwood floors. I cried at his high school graduation in the living room because it rained and we couldn't use the backyard. That house wasn't just property. It was the physical record of my entire adult life. Gerald passed 6 years ago. Prostate cancer. It was quick, as these things go, which people say is a mercy. But quick doesn't mean painless. Not for the one left behind. After he died, I rattled around those 4 bedrooms alone for a while, and I won't pretend it was easy. But I found my rhythm. I had my garden. I had my neighbor Connie, who brought me sweet potato pie every Sunday after church. I had my book club on Thursdays. I had a life that was smaller than before, yes, but it was mine, and it was good. Marcus called more after his father died. At first, I was grateful. He'd always been a distant son, not cold, exactly, but busy. The way men of his generation convince themselves is the same thing as responsible. He married Renata 7 years ago. She was a real estate agent, which I mention not as gossip, but because it becomes important later. She had sharp nails, a sharper smile, and a habit of looking at rooms the way a butcher looks at livestock. I noticed small things changing about a year before everything fell apart. Marcus started asking questions about the house. Practical questions at first. Had I updated the will? Did I have a financial advisor? Was I keeping up with the property taxes? I answered honestly. Yes, the will was updated. No, I didn't need an advisor. Gerald had left me comfortable. Yes, the taxes were paid. He nodded at everything I said, but there was something in his expression I couldn't name then. I can name it now. It was calculation. Renata started coming to Sunday dinners more often. She complimented my kitchen. She complimented my floors. She said things like, "Dorothy, this neighborhood has really come up," in the way people say things that are meant to sound like compliments, but are actually appraisals. I smiled and passed the bread and told myself I was being uncharitable. Then came the dinner in late October. Marcus mentioned, casually, the way people mention things they've rehearsed to sound casual, that there were assisted living communities in the area that were really lovely. He said he and Renata had been thinking about my future. He used the word proactive. Renata nodded, with her hands folded on the table like a woman in a board meeting. I was 71 years old, in full possession of my faculties, gardening 3 days a week and walking 2 miles every morning. Assisted living. I looked at my son across my own dinner table and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. A door closing. I didn't say much that night. I'm not a reactive woman. Gerald always said my greatest strength was that I thought before I spoke. I cleared the dishes and said goodnight and stood at my kitchen sink in the dark for a long time. Then came the message. It was a Tuesday. Early November, the leaves already down. My phone buzzed on the counter while I was making tea. A voice message from Marcus. I pressed play without thinking. It wasn't meant for me. His voice was low, purposeful, the voice he used for business. "Renata, call me back. We're on schedule. I talked to her last week. She didn't push back on the living situation conversation. We moved to the next step before the holidays while she's distracted. We signed the papers Friday. Then silence. Then the message ended. I stood there with my kettle in my hand and the steam rising between my fingers, and I played it again and again. Sign the papers. What papers? Next step. What step? She didn't push back. She. Me. I was the she. I was the subject of a plan that had a schedule and a next step and a Friday. My tea went cold. I didn't drink it. I set the kettle down very carefully, the way you set things down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want them to. I had a decision to make. And I had until Friday. I didn't sleep that night. I want to be honest about that because I think sometimes in stories like this, the protagonist is made to seem braver than they were in the dark hours. I was not brave at 2 a.m. I was a 71-year-old woman sitting in her bedroom with a legal pad and a ballpoint pen, writing down everything I owned and everything I stood to lose. The house was worth, by my last estimate, somewhere between $400,000 and $430,000. The neighborhood had indeed come up, as Renata put it, and I was no longer naive enough to think she'd said it as a compliment. I owned it outright. No mortgage, no liens. Gerald and I had paid it off in 2009, the same year Marcus graduated from college, and I remember the celebration dinner we had that night like it was a scene from someone else's life. A happy scene from a simpler time. Beyond the house, my savings account held $112,000. My IRA was worth a bit over $200,000. A modest life insurance policy. Gerald's pension continuation. I was not rich by any measure, but I was stable. More than stable. I was, by any reasonable definition, secure, which made me a target. I wrote that word on the legal pad. Target. I stared at it for a long time. Was I being dramatic? That was the question that kept circling. Marcus was my son. I had held him when he cried. I had driven him to soccer practice in the rain. Was I honestly sitting here at 2 a.m. treating my own child like an adversary? I went back and forth on this for longer than I'd like to admit, replaying the voice message in my memory, testing each word for another interpretation. We signed the papers. Friday. What else could that mean? Papers for what? A surprise party? A vacation home? No. I knew what it meant. And the cruelest part of betrayal is that the moment of knowing and the moment of accepting are not the same moment. I knew at 2 a.m. I accepted it, quietly and completely, somewhere around 4, when the darkness outside my window was just beginning to suggest the idea of dawn. Then I stopped grieving and started thinking. I am not, by nature, a passive woman. I worked as a paralegal for 22 years before I retired. I know how documents work. I know what signatures mean. I know that the difference between a plan and an accomplished fact is often nothing more than timing and paperwork. Whatever Marcus and Renata were planning to bring me on Friday, I needed to understand it before it arrived. My first call, at 8:30 the next morning, was to my attorney. His name is Howard Bellamy, and he has handled my family's legal affairs for 19 years. He is thorough, unhurried, and deeply skeptical of everything, which are precisely the qualities you want in a lawyer. I told him I had received information suggesting someone might be moving to challenge my competency or otherwise gain legal control over my assets. I did not tell him who. Not yet. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Come in Thursday." My second call was to the bank. I spoke to a branch manager named Patricia, whom I'd known for years. I didn't disclose specifics, but I asked very specific questions about what would be required to make any changes to accounts with my name on them. She walked me through the protocols. I wrote everything down. My third step was not a call. I went to my desk in the study, the desk where Gerald used to pay bills, and where I'd kept every important document for 40 years. And I pulled out the deed to the house, my will, my power of attorney documents, and every financial statement going back 3 years. I spread them on the kitchen table like a map. I looked for vulnerabilities the way you look for drafts in a house. You feel for the cold air, you follow it to its source. And I found one. The power of attorney document I had drawn up after Gerald died named Marcus as my agent in the event of my incapacitation. At the time, I had signed it without real consideration. He was my son. Who else would I name? But a power of attorney is a powerful instrument, and in the wrong hands. In hands that were already moving toward a Friday deadline, it was a door I had left unlocked. That afternoon, I called Howard Bellamy's office again and added one more item to Thursday's agenda: revoking the existing power of attorney and drawing up a new one. I also had another idea, a bigger one that would take more than a phone call to execute. I sat with it through the evening, testing it the way you test ice before you step onto a frozen lake. It held. I decided to move forward. Marcus called that evening, cheerful and warm, asking how I was feeling. I told him I was just fine. I asked about Renata. He said she was wonderful. We talked for 12 minutes about nothing. When I hung up, I sat in the silence of my kitchen and thought, he has no idea. That thought, I will confess, was the first thing that had made me feel like myself in 36 hours. Thursday came gray and cold, the kind of November morning that makes the inside of a law office feel like a sanctuary. Howard Bellamy's practice was on the second floor of a brick building downtown, above an insurance broker and below a dentist, and I had climbed those stairs more times than I could count. For Gerald's estate, for my own will, for a boundary dispute with a neighbor back in 2014. Howard himself was 63, trim, with reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead like a man who'd forgotten they were there. He stood when I came in, which he always did, and he waited until his assistant had closed the door before he sat back down. I told him everything. I played him the voice message. I watched his face, which is not an expressive face under ordinary circumstances, tighten almost imperceptibly around the eyes. "Tell me about the power of attorney," he said when I'd finished. I explained what I'd found. He pulled up the document on his computer, read it in silence for 2 full minutes, then took his glasses off his forehead and set them on the desk. "Dorothy," he said, "what you've recorded is not, by itself, evidence of a specific legal action, but it is consistent with a pattern I've seen before. The combination of guardianship proceedings and real estate maneuver. They'd need to establish that you're incapacitated or convince you to sign something voluntarily under pressure. The POA is a significant exposure." We revoked it that afternoon. Howard drafted a new one naming my younger sister, Claudette, who lives in Atlanta, and who has never once in her life looked at a room and mentally calculated its resale value. He also drafted a letter to the bank formally noting the change. I signed everything before I left his office. When I walked back out to the parking lot, I felt lighter in a way that was almost physical, like I'd set down a bag I hadn't realized I was carrying. But revoking the POA was defense. I needed offense. Here is the bigger idea I had been sitting with. I knew Marcus and Renata were planning to have me sign something on Friday. I didn't know exactly what. A voluntary transfer of the property? Consent to a guardianship assessment? Something in between? What I needed was to know exactly what they were bringing to my door, and I needed a witness. I called Connie that evening. She is 68, a retired school teacher, and the most quietly formidable person I have ever known in a civilian context. I explained the situation in full. There was a long pause on her end of the phone. "Do you want me there Friday?" she asked. "I want you in the kitchen," I said, "where they won't see you." "Done," she said. No hesitation. That same evening, something happened that I hadn't planned for. Marcus called and this time there was a different texture to his voice. Not warm, not casual. Careful. "Mom," he said, "did you talk to a lawyer recently?" I kept my voice absolutely level. "I see Howard periodically, Marcus. You know that." "Right," he said. Pause. "Renata just wanted to make sure you weren't, you know, getting confused about anything. Signing things you don't need to sign." Confused. That was the word he chose. I let it sit in the air for a moment before I answered. "I'm not confused about a thing," I said pleasantly. After I hung up, I understood two things. First, Howard's paperwork had already generated some kind of alert, probably through the bank notification. They knew I'd done something. They didn't know what, but they knew I'd moved. Second, they were accelerating. The word confused was not accidental. They were beginning to lay groundwork for a competency narrative. That made Friday more urgent, not less. And then Friday arrived, and with it came the document. They came at 10 in the morning, Marcus and Renata, dressed as if for a real estate closing, which, I would later understand, was not coincidental. Renata carried a leather portfolio. Marcus wore his blazer. They sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had fed my son 1,000 breakfasts, and Renata opened the portfolio and slid a document across the surface toward me. It was a quitclaim deed. They were asking me to sign over ownership of my house. There was a cover letter full of phrases like estate planning simplification and avoiding probate delays and protecting the family asset. Renata explained it in a calm, practiced voice that told me she had rehearsed this moment. Marcus watched me with the expression of someone who has already decided the answer is yes. In the kitchen, behind the closed door, I knew Connie was listening. I looked at the quitclaim deed for a long moment. Then I looked at my son. "Can I keep this to review?" I asked. The hesitation before he answered told me everything the voice message hadn't already. I kept the document. Marcus said, with a studied casualness, that they'd need it back by the following Friday, that the timing mattered for tax purposes. I nodded. I said I understood. I walked them to the door, and I watched Renata's eyes sweep the living room one final time as she stepped across the threshold. The involuntary appraisal she couldn't suppress even now. The door closed behind them. I stood in the hallway for a moment in silence. Then I heard Connie emerge from the kitchen. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression set in the way it gets when she's angry, but too disciplined to raise her voice. "A quitclaim deed," she said. "A quitclaim deed," I confirmed. We sat at the kitchen table, the document between us, and we looked at it the way you look at something dangerous. Howard had already told me what a quitclaim deed was and what it meant. A complete transfer of property ownership, no payment required, no contingencies. Sign it, and my house, $400,000 of my life, would belong to Marcus and Renata. Not upon my death. Immediately. That afternoon, I drove back to Howard's office and put the deed in his hands. He photographed every page. He noted that the document had been prepared by a real estate attorney whose name appeared on paperwork Renata had filed professionally in the past, which established a clear prior relationship. "This wasn't a spontaneous idea," Howard said. "This was planned." He advised me to say nothing further to Marcus or Renata while he prepared a response, and he suggested I might want to have my own doctor provide a current written assessment of my cognitive health, preemptive documentation, in case a competency challenge came. I had that appointment the following Monday. My physician of 14 years, Dr. Sandra Okafor, administered the standard screening assessments and wrote a letter on her letterhead that stated in clear medical language that I was fully cognitively intact, competent to manage my own affairs, and showed no signs of diminished capacity. I kept 3 copies. Howard kept 2. Then came the phone call I had been expecting. It was Wednesday evening, 4 days after the Friday visit. Marcus called, and his voice had lost the practiced warmth entirely. It was flat, businesslike, with an edge underneath it that I hadn't heard from him since he was 17 and caught in a lie. "Mom," he said, "we know you talked to an attorney about the deed. Renata spoke to her colleagues. There's talk of a formal process." "What kind of process?" I asked. "A guardianship evaluation," he said. "It's not something we want, but if you refuse to cooperate with reasonable estate planning, it may become necessary." He paused. "We're only trying to protect you." There it was. The threat wrapped in the language of care. I want to tell you that I was icily composed. The truth is that my hand was trembling slightly, and I had to sit down on the edge of the bed. Guardianship proceedings, even baseless ones, are not nothing. They are expensive. They are public. They are emotionally devastating. They can drag on for months. The goal wasn't necessarily to win. The goal might simply be to exhaust me into signing. But I had something Marcus didn't know about yet. "Marcus," I said, and I kept my voice completely steady, "I am 71 years old, and I am not confused. And I want you to understand that I have documentation of the conversation that began all of this. The voicemail you sent me by accident. I have had it preserved, transcribed, and reviewed by legal counsel. If a guardianship petition is filed against me, that recording will be part of my response." Silence. It lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "Mom, that message wasn't—" "I'm not angry, Marcus," I said. "I'm simply informed. Good night." I hung up. He did not call back that night. He did not call the next day. The guardianship threat, which had been hovering like a weather system, seemed to stall. After that call, I gave myself the weekend. I put the legal pad in the desk drawer. I didn't answer calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I sat in my garden on Saturday afternoon with coffee, even though it was cold, and I watched the bare branches of the oak tree, Marcus's oak tree, the one we planted the summer he was born, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the grief that strategic thinking had been holding at bay. It was not a small grief. It was the loss of the version of my son I had believed in for 50 years. I let myself feel it. Then, on Sunday evening, I made a cup of tea, sat back down at the kitchen table, and went back to work. The first attempt at seduction, and I can only call it that, came on a Tuesday, 10 days after the guardianship threat had gone quiet. Renata called. Not Marcus. Renata. This in itself was information. Her voice was different from the version she'd used at my kitchen table with the leather portfolio. This version was softer, almost confessional. She said she'd been thinking a lot. She said that Marcus had been stressed about money, more stressed than I knew. She said the real estate market had been unkind to them. She said she was sorry if the conversation had come across wrong. She used the phrase "come across wrong" twice, which meant she had practiced it. Then came the offer. They would move in with me, she said. Help me with the house. Take over the bills. I could deed the property to them now, but remain living in my home for the rest of my life. Completely protected, completely cared for. It would be a family arrangement. It would be love made practical. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I noted the precision of the offer, the way it had been constructed to address every objection while leaving intact the core transfer of ownership. This was not a change of heart. This was a revised proposal. I appreciate you calling, Renata, I said. I'll think about it. I did not think about it. I wrote down the substance of the conversation immediately after hanging up, with the date and time, and I sent the notes to Howard Bellamy. But the call had told me something important. They were watching me. They were monitoring whether I showed signs of wavering. The fact that they sent Renata rather than Marcus suggested they had decided Marcus had damaged the relationship and a softer approach was required. They were not done. They were recalibrating, which meant I needed to be more careful and I needed more people in my corner. I had been hesitant to involve anyone beyond Connie and Howard. This is a pride I'll admit to freely. I did not want to be a woman with a problem. I had spent 50 years being a woman who solved problems, and there is an enormous psychological distance between those two identities. But the Tuesday call from Renata clarified something. This was not a fight I could win through pure individual fortitude. I needed community. I started with my book club. There were 6 of us who met every Thursday evening at rotating houses. We had been reading together for 11 years. We'd been through divorces and diagnoses and grandchildren and losses, and there is a particular kind of honesty that develops between women who have met consistently in each other's living rooms for over a decade. I didn't tell them everything on that first Thursday. I told them enough. I said that my son and his wife were attempting to pressure me out of my home, that I had legal support in place, but that I was finding the isolation of the situation difficult. The response was immediate and practical. Margaret, who was a retired family court mediator, said she could recommend a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse cases, a subspecialty I hadn't known existed until she named it. Ellen, who had been through her own estate battle with her stepchildren years ago, said she would come with me to any meetings I needed moral support for. Connie, who had already been in my kitchen on the critical Friday, simply squeezed my hand and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. I left book club that Thursday feeling something I hadn't felt since the voice message, that I was not operating alone. Margaret's referral led me to an attorney named Diana Foss, who worked specifically in elder financial abuse and exploitation cases. I met with her the following week. She reviewed everything Howard had: the voicemail, the quitclaim deed, the notes from Renata's call, Dr. Okafor's letter. She was in her mid-40s, brisk and precise, and she said something that I have thought about many times since. What they've done so far is attempted, not completed, she told me. If we document it correctly, attempted can be as powerful as completed in the right proceeding. She explained that what Marcus and Renata had engaged in had a name in California statute. It was called undue influence, the use of pressure, manipulation, or deception to override an elder person's free will regarding their assets. It didn't require them to have succeeded. The attempt itself was actionable. I drove home from that meeting through the early December dark, and I thought about the oak tree in my backyard, the one we'd planted 46 years ago when Marcus was born. I thought about how long it had taken to grow into something you couldn't move. I thought about roots. I was not moving. They came in person on a Saturday, 2 weeks before Christmas. I saw Marcus's car pull into the driveway from the kitchen window, and I knew immediately from the way they both got out, quickly, in tandem, without the casual delay of people making a social call, that this was not a visit. It was an intervention. I had perhaps 30 seconds before the doorbell rang, and I used them to set down my coffee cup, stand up straight, and decide who I was going to be in the next hour. I opened the door before they could ring. "Marcus," I said. "Renata, come in." The living room had the particular quality of afternoon winter light that makes everything look slightly exposed. We sat. Me in Gerald's old armchair, the 2 of them on the sofa across from me. Renata had the leather portfolio again. Marcus had something else, an expression I recognized from his childhood, the one he wore when he had decided that what he wanted was non-negotiable, and the only question was how long the conversation would take. It started reasonably. Marcus said he was worried about me. He said the house was too large for one person. He said that maintaining it alone was a burden I didn't need to carry. He said all of this in the measured voice of someone who has thought carefully about how to say things without technically saying them. I noticed how he avoided eye contact when he spoke about my well-being. A small thing, but a tell I recognized from the same boy who used to look at the floor when he hadn't done his homework. Then, Renata took over. She opened the portfolio. Not the quitclaim deed this time. Something different. A document she described as a family agreement, more informal than a legal transfer, just an understanding between family members about long-term plans for the property. She said her attorney had drawn it up. She said it was completely fair. She said the word fair the way people say it when the arrangement benefits them enormously and they know it. She also said that other families did this kind of thing all the time, as if normalcy were a legal argument, as if frequency made something right. She slid it across the coffee table. I didn't pick it up. I'd need my attorney to review anything before I signed it, I said. Marcus leaned forward. Mom, Howard Bellamy is a nice man, but he doesn't specialize in family estate matters. He may not understand what's best for you here. He understands what I've asked him to understand, I said. Then Renata added, almost gently, that she had spoken with a financial planner who agreed that transferring the property now made enormous sense from a tax standpoint. She named a figure, the amount the family could supposedly save in estate taxes, and she said it with the confident fluency of a woman who had used numbers to close transactions before. It was a good performance. If I had been a different woman, in a different situation, without 4 months of preparation behind me, it might have worked. Then came the shift. The masks, as I thought of them, slipped. Renata said, and I want to be precise, because precision matters, that if I continued to refuse reasonable family arrangements, she and Marcus would have no choice but to petition for a formal competency hearing. She said this in the same tone she might use to say she had no choice but to park in a loading zone. Flat. Practical. As if my mental competency was a parking problem. Marcus didn't contradict her. I looked at my son. I looked at the man who had stood under this roof and cried when his father died, who had sat at the table behind that sofa and eaten the first Thanksgiving dinner he ever hosted at my house, because he'd wanted to learn. I looked at him, and I tried to find something that explained this, some wound or fear that had turned him into someone who would sit in his mother's living room and threaten her. I didn't find it. Or perhaps I found too much of it, and it didn't excuse anything. I think, I said carefully, that you should both leave now. Renata stood up immediately, another sign of rehearsal. Marcus stood more slowly. He picked up the family agreement document from the coffee table and returned it to the portfolio with the deliberate care of someone who intends to bring it back. At the door, he turned around. Mom, he said, we're not trying to hurt you. You're making this harder than it has to be. I know you believe that, I said, and I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long moment after their car left the driveway. The house was very quiet. Outside, the December light was already fading at 4 in the afternoon, the way it does in winter, turning the street gold and then gray in the span of 10 minutes. I watched it happen through the narrow window beside the door. Then I went to the kitchen table and sat down, and I let the fear come, because it had been waiting all afternoon, and denying it would only make it worse. The fear was real and specific. A competency hearing, even a failed one, could cost $20,000, $30,000 in legal fees. It could take a year. It could place my affairs under court supervision during the process. They had leverage, even if every legal claim they had was false. But here is what I noticed, sitting there in the winter kitchen. The fear was clarifying rather than paralyzing. Every time they threatened, I understood more precisely what they were and what I was dealing with. And every time I understood that more completely, the question of whether to continue fighting answered itself. I picked up the phone and called Diana Foss. It was Saturday afternoon, and she answered anyway. They've escalated, I told her. Good, she said, in a tone that surprised me. Escalation leaves evidence. Are you ready to move to the next phase? I told her I was. The hearing was set for a Wednesday in February. I want to tell you about the weeks leading up to it, because the preparation was itself a kind of resolution, each step a decision, and each decision a small act of reclaiming myself. Diana Foss filed a preemptive action on my behalf, a civil complaint alleging attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under California's Elder Abuse and Dependent Adult Civil Protection Act. The filing named Marcus Calloway and Renata Calloway. It cited the voice message, the quitclaim deed, the Saturday visit, and Renata's competency threat. It was thorough in the way that documents become when they are built from months of careful note-taking. Diana had also advised me, in those preparatory weeks, to keep a daily log, dates, times, any contact from Marcus or Renata, however minor, a text message, a missed call, a voicemail asking how I was feeling. She wanted a complete record of the pressure pattern, not just its peaks. I kept that log in a spiral notebook on the kitchen counter, and I wrote in it every single day, even when the entry was simply, no contact. The absence of contact, she explained, was itself data. It mapped to moments when they believed they had made progress, when they were waiting to see if the previous pressure had softened me. The competency hearing that Marcus and Renata had threatened never materialized into a formal petition. Diana had anticipated this. Once they understood that I had filed first, and once their attorney reviewed what was in our complaint, the tactical landscape changed entirely. A competency petition would now require them to take the stand and explain, under oath, the voice message. Explain the quitclaim deed. Explain Renata's professional relationship with the attorney who drafted it. The risk calculation reversed. But there was still the matter of our complaint. Marcus and Renata hired a family law attorney named Garrett, who filed a response claiming that the quitclaim deed had been a misunderstanding, that they had been acting in their mother's best interests, that the voice message had been taken out of context. In their version of events, they were caring children who had been misrepresented by a confused and perhaps manipulated mother. The word confused appeared 3 times in Garrett's filing. Each time I read it, I felt a small, cold spark that I had learned by now to recognize as useful. On the Wednesday morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. Dark gray blazer. The pearl earrings Gerald gave me on our 25th anniversary. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, and I thought about what I was walking into, and I thought, I have been preparing for this for 4 months. I drove to the courthouse myself. Diana met me on the steps. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of winter day that makes buildings look very solid and the sky look very far away. I found something steadying in that, the solidity of stone stairs under my feet, the simple physical fact of being somewhere, upright, prepared. The courtroom was smaller than the ones on television. The judge was a woman named Honorable Frances Cho, who had, according to Diana, a reputation for brevity and precision. Garrett sat with Marcus and Renata at the respondents' table. I did not look at my son. I had made the decision not to look at him until I needed to. The proceedings began with Garrett presenting his client's position. The deed was an innocent estate planning tool. The voice message was a private communication about paperwork, no sinister intent. His clients were devoted family members. He said the words devoted and family with a frequency that I found, quietly, to be its own kind of argument. Then Diana presented ours. She started with the timeline. She was methodical and unhurried, which I had come to understand was deliberate. She wanted the weight of each item to land fully before she moved to the next. The voice message, the revoking of the POA, the bank notification, the delivery of the quitclaim deed, the competency threat, the Saturday visit, the family agreement document. And then, this was the element that Marcus and Renata had not known about, the testimony of Renata's own former colleague. Diana had spent 2 months locating a woman who had worked with Renata at her former brokerage, who had left after witnessing what she described as a pattern of targeting elderly homeowners with limited family support and pressuring them into below-market transactions. The woman had agreed to testify. She was under subpoena. She was calm on the stand in the way that people are calm when they have been waiting a long time to say something true in a room where it will be formally recorded. When Garrett stood to cross-examine her, he made the mistake that Diana had anticipated. He challenged her credibility by suggesting a personal grievance. The witness, calm and specific, responded by producing an email she had sent to Renata's former supervising broker in 2019, 3 years before Renata ever met me, describing this exact pattern of behavior. It had been documented. It had been reported internally. Nothing had been done. I watched Marcus's face when that email was entered into evidence. I had not seen that expression on him before, and I hope never to see it again. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was. It was the expression of someone who has been caught, not just in an act, but in a character. Beside him, Renata sat very still, the stillness of a person recalculating. Garrett called for a recess. The judge declined. I sat very still. I had learned over these months that stillness was its own kind of power. I let the room do what it was doing. I listened to the testimony continue. I watched the narrative Marcus and Renata had constructed, caring family, confused mother, innocent paperwork, come apart piece by piece, not dramatically, but the way a badly built thing comes apart. Steadily, inevitably, because it was never sound to begin with. Diana rested her presentation. Judge Cho made a note. She looked at Garrett and asked him if he wished to respond to the witness's 2019 email. There was a long pause at the respondent's table. "Your Honor," Garrett said slowly, "I'd ask for time to consult with my clients." "You have 15 minutes, the judge said. In the hallway, through the closed door, I could hear raised voices. Marcus's and Renata's. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the shape of the argument. The accusatory rhythm of 2 people deciding whose fault it was. Diana sat beside me on the hallway bench and said nothing. She didn't need to. We both knew what was happening on the other side of that door. The 15 minutes stretched to 25. When Garrett returned, he looked like a man who had aged in a hallway. He informed the court that his clients were prepared to settle. Judge Cho looked at him over her glasses with the expression of a woman who has seen this particular moment many times and has formed no romantic illusions about what it means. It did not mean remorse. It meant calculation, a different calculation than the one that had brought them here, but calculation nonetheless. She asked whether both parties were present and consenting. Garrett confirmed. Diana confirmed. I nodded when Judge Cho looked at me directly, which she did, and I held her gaze, which felt important. Diana conferred with me in a whisper. The settlement offer was a full written withdrawal of any claims to my property, a signed acknowledgement that the quitclaim deed had been presented under false pretenses, and a stipulated order permanently barring Marcus and Renata from initiating any guardianship or competency proceedings against me absent new medical evidence. In exchange, I would not pursue criminal referrals to the County Elder Abuse Unit, which Diana had already been in correspondence with, and Marcus would avoid any professional consequences from Bar Association scrutiny of the attorney who had drafted the deed under Renata's direction. I asked Diana one question. Is there anything in this settlement that limits what I can do going forward with my own property? She said no. I said yes. Judge Cho reviewed and approved the settlement agreement on the record, She added, without being asked, a written notation that the evidence presented established a pattern consistent with attempted elder financial exploitation, and that this notation would be part of the public record of the proceedings. She looked at Garrett as she said it, not at Marcus or Renata directly. She didn't need to. The notation would follow the case file. It would be findable. It would be permanent. What I remember most about that moment is how quiet the courtroom was when the gavel came down. Not the dramatic silence of a movie, but the ordinary, functional silence of a room returning to its normal business. People gathered papers. Chairs shifted. Garrett spoke to Marcus in a low voice with his back turned. Renata did not look at me. She was looking at the table in front of her with an expression I recognized. Not shame, exactly, but the specific blankness of someone reorganizing around a new reality. The moment the gavel came down, I felt something leave my body. I don't have a better description than that. Something that had been living in my chest since November. A compressed, careful vigilance that had become so familiar I'd stopped feeling it as weight. Simply released. I did not cry. I had not cried since the morning I listened to the voice message and the kettle steamed between my fingers, and I don't think that is a virtue so much as a coping mechanism. But I stood in the courthouse hallway afterward, and I breathed, and Connie was there. She had come. She had sat in the gallery through the entire proceeding, silent and present. And she hugged me, and I let her. I held on for longer than I usually let myself hold on to things, which felt like its own kind of honesty. Afterward, there were practical matters. The settlement was filed. Howard Bellamy updated my estate documents to remove any remaining ambiguity about the property. Diana Foss sent the full case file to the County Elder Abuse Unit anyway, with the notation that her client had settled, but that Renata's documented pattern warranted their awareness. She also sent a courtesy copy to the real estate board that governed Renata's license. She did this not vindictively, but precisely. Renata had used her professional knowledge and professional connections to construct this scheme, and the institutions that had licensed her deserved to know what that license had been used to attempt. I did not make those calls myself. I did not need to. I had simply told the truth, in the right forum, with the right documentation, and the truth had found its own momentum. Marcus called me once, 3 weeks after the settlement. He was quiet on the phone, the way a person is quiet when they're not sure what register they should be speaking in. He said he was sorry. The apology was not short. He spoke for several minutes, and some of what he said was specific in the way that genuine remorse is specific. He named things he had done, not just offered a general expression of regret. He said he had told himself it was practical. He said he had let Renata lead when he should have stopped and asked himself harder questions. He said he knew that none of it was an excuse. I listened to all of it. I believed parts of it. I told him I heard him. I told him I needed time. I did not tell him that time might not be sufficient, because that was a question I was still sitting with, and I refused to lie to him even now. What I did not do was reconsider. There is a difference between forgiveness and restoration, and I had earned the right to understand that difference clearly. I went home after that call, and I walked through every room of my house on Birchwood Lane. I walked slowly, the way you walk when you want to feel something. The hardwood floors under my feet. The kitchen window where the light comes in at 4 in the afternoon, in a way I have never once stopped being grateful for. The oak tree visible through the back door, bare still in early March, but already, if you looked closely, beginning to suggest the faintest idea of leaves. My house, my name on the deed, my life, intact. I put the kettle on. I sat down at my kitchen table. I thought about 41 years and everything they'd held, and I thought that some things, if you fight for them with enough precision and enough patience and enough help from the right people, turn out to be exactly as worth it as you always believed they were. Spring came to Birchwood Lane the way it always does, gradually, and then all at once. I noticed it first in the backyard, the oak tree coming back into itself, the crabapple along the fence putting out its first pink suggestions, the soil in the garden beds beginning to give under the trowel the way soil does when it's ready to receive something. I planted sweet peas in March and cherry tomatoes in April, and I found in the work of those mornings something I hadn't expected. Not just peace, which I'd been hoping for, but a kind of joy that was different in texture from anything I'd felt in years. It had been earned, this joy. It had specific roots. I noticed I was humming while I gardened. Old songs, Gerald's favorites. And I didn't stop myself. Some things that grief puts away, time quietly returns. Howard Bellamy called in April to finalize the last of the paperwork. He told me, with the understated satisfaction he permitted himself on occasions like this, that everything was in order. The deed was clean. The estate documents were solid. The public record of the proceedings was there, immutable, should it ever be needed. He also mentioned, somewhat against his habitual reserve, that our case had been discussed at a continuing legal education seminar, anonymized, but used as an example of thorough preemptive documentation by an elder client. I thanked him in a way that formal words rarely capture. 19 years of trust had turned out to be worth exactly what I'd believed it was worth. Diana Foss had become something closer to a friend than an attorney by the time our formal engagement ended. We had lunch in May at a quiet Italian place near her office, the kind of lunch that stretches past the hour you'd planned for because the conversation earns the time. She told me she was using elements of our case in a presentation for a statewide elder law conference. The pattern Marcus and Renata had employed was not unique, she said. It happened regularly and succeeded regularly because it preyed on the thing most elderly people found hardest to overcome: the reluctance to believe that the threat was real and the reluctance to act against their own children. You acted, she said, when most people don't. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about the version of myself that might have existed, the woman who signed the quitclaim deed that Friday in November because she couldn't bring herself to believe her own son meant it. That woman was not foolish. She would have been entirely understandable. She simply would have lost everything. Book club resumed its normal rhythm, but it had changed in a way that was impossible to put back. Margaret's referral to Diana had, in a very real sense, changed the outcome of the entire case. Ellen's offer to accompany me to any meetings had reminded me I wasn't isolated when isolation felt most possible. Connie's presence in the gallery on the day of the hearing, silent, permanent, a fact of the room, had given me something I hadn't known I needed: the simple knowledge that someone who loved me was watching, and that what happened to me mattered to another person in real time. I said all of this to them one Thursday evening in June, more directly than I usually say things. There were tears around the table, which surprised me, and then didn't. These were women who had built decades of life and were not sentimental about the wrong things. When the right things came along, they knew the difference. My relationship with Marcus was another matter, and I want to be honest about it rather than tidy. He called periodically through the spring. The calls were careful and somewhat formal, the way conversations are when the shape of a relationship has changed and both parties are still learning the new edges. I was not cold. I was not warm in the way I had been, which was perhaps the most accurate measure of what had happened. Some damage can be repaired, some is structural. I had not yet determined which kind this was, and I had decided I was under no obligation to determine it quickly. In late May, I learned through my niece, Claudette's daughter, that Renata's real estate license was under review. The real estate board had received Diana's correspondence. There had been prior complaints that had been filed and quietly shelved. They were now unshelved. 3 former clients had been contacted, too, had agreed to provide statements. Renata had taken a leave of absence from her brokerage, and the brokerage itself had released a statement distancing itself from her conduct. If her license was restricted or revoked, fewer elderly people would be exposed to what I had been exposed to. That mattered to me. Her personal unhappiness did not occupy my thoughts. Marcus, from what I gathered, was managing a financial situation more precarious than he had ever let on. Without the asset he had been planning to acquire, certain debts had become acute. He and Renata had moved from their townhouse to a smaller rental apartment on the east side of the city, a fact Marcus mentioned himself in the flat tone of a man reporting things he has made his peace with. I said I hoped he was managing, and I meant it in the limited, honest way the situation permitted. I turned 72 in July. Connie brought sweet potato pie, as she always does. The book club came over in the evening. We sat on the back porch with the oak tree above us, its full summer canopy blocking the worst of the heat, and someone poured lemonade, and someone told a story that made everyone laugh, and I sat in the middle of all of it and felt, not dramatically, but in a settled, certain way, that this was the life I had fought for. Not a life without grief, or without the particular ache of knowing that the son I had raised was not entirely the man I'd believed him to be, but a life that was mine, rooted, documented, protected, shared with people who had shown up when it mattered. The oak tree moved slightly in the evening breeze, its leaves catching the last of the light. Gerald and I had planted it the summer Marcus was born. It was 46 years old. It wasn't going anywhere. Neither was I. If there is one thing this taught me, it is that love and loyalty are not the same thing, and that knowing the difference is not a betrayal. It is a form of survival. I was a woman who believed in family. I still am. But I learned that belief cannot be unconditional where your own safety is at stake. I fought for my home. I documented everything. I asked for help. And I won. What would you have done, standing in that kitchen with a cold cup of tea and a voice message that wasn't meant for you? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below, and thank you for listening. My children took me to court to take my home and put me in a nursing home. My son's lawyer smirked. She has no chance. But I said 3 words. The judge dropped his papers, and, good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I have lived in the same house on Elm Creek Road for 51 years. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because the house is not just a house. Harold and I built it, not with a contractor, not with hired hands, but with our own savings, our own weekends, our own blistered palms. We planted the oak tree in the backyard the summer Daniel was born. We painted the kitchen yellow the year Linda came home from the hospital. Every scratch on the doorframe was a child's height recorded in pencil. Every creak in the 3rd stair was the sound of a family growing up. Harold passed in 2019. Prostate cancer. He went quietly in the bedroom we shared for 43 years, with my hand in his and the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. I grieved. I grieved deeply, the way you grieve when someone has been the other half of your breathing for so long that you aren't sure which thoughts were yours to begin with. But I did not fall apart. I am 74 years old. I have buried a husband, a mother, a best friend, and a dog I loved more than some people I've met. I know how to carry weight. After Harold died, I settled into a quieter life. I tended the garden. I had my book club on Thursdays. Ruth, Connie, Beverly, and I, had been meeting since 1998. I drove myself to the grocery store. I cooked proper meals. I was not frail. I was not confused. I was a woman living alone in her own home, which is a perfectly ordinary thing to be at 74. Daniel called more often after the funeral. That should have been my first sign. My son is 51 years old. He works in commercial real estate in Phoenix, which is a 4-hour drive from my house in Tucson. He has a wife named Cheryl, who has always looked at my furniture like she's pricing it, and 2 teenage sons who I love, despite the fact that they cannot hold a conversation longer than 30 seconds without checking their phones. Daniel was always the practical one. Harold's word for it was practical, though I sometimes thought calculating was closer to the truth. He could look at any situation and find the angle that served him best. I used to admire that. I used to think it was intelligence. Linda is 47. She lives 20 minutes from me, which means I saw her far more than I saw Daniel, though I'm not sure that translated into closeness. Linda is soft-spoken in public and sharp-tongued at home. I'd watched that pattern her whole life. She married a man named Greg, who lost his accounting job in 2021 and had not, as far as I could tell, replaced it. They had 3 kids and a mortgage, and a lifestyle that I suspected cost more than it should. The calls from Daniel started in late 2022. Friendly at first, checking in, asking how I was feeling, whether I'd been to the doctor, whether I'd had any trouble with the stairs. I answered honestly. I was fine. Yes, I'd had my checkup. No, the stairs were not a problem. Then he started visiting. 3 weekends in 6 months, which was more than he'd visited in the previous 2 years combined. He brought Cheryl. They walked through the house with their eyes moving in ways that made me feel like I was already gone. Linda, meanwhile, began stopping by unannounced. She'd find small things to worry about. A dish left in the sink, a bill on the counter she deemed unpaid. It was paid, I'd simply not filed it yet. Once a single burned-out light bulb in the hallway that she photographed with her phone before I could change it. I noticed the photographs. I didn't say anything. I filed the observation away in the back of my mind the way you file things you hope you'll never need. The first real moment, the one I kept returning to later, the one that should have made me act sooner, happened on a Sunday afternoon in March of 2023. Daniel and Linda were both at the house, which was unusual. They said they'd coordinated the visit to surprise me. We had lunch. We talked about the grandchildren. And then, over coffee, Daniel set a manila folder on the kitchen table. "Mom," he said, "we've been talking, and we think it might be time to consider some options." Inside the folder was a brochure for a senior living facility called Sunrise Pines. Private rooms, organized activities, memory support services, which is a phrase designed to make you feel that needing it is inevitable rather than exceptional. I looked at the brochure. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter, who was examining her coffee cup. "I'm not moving," I said. Daniel smiled. The patient, measured smile of someone who believes the conversation is already decided. "Nobody's saying you have to do anything right now. We're just starting a conversation." But I knew, sitting in my own kitchen, at my own table, in the house Harold and I had built with our own hands, that this was not the beginning of a conversation. It was the beginning of a plan, and I had not yet begun to make mine. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bedroom Harold and I had shared, and I stared at the ceiling, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened at that kitchen table. Not the shock of it. I am too old for shock. But the grief of it. The particular grief that comes when you realize that people you loved, people you raised, have been calculating behind your back. I thought about the brochure. Sunrise Pines. I had looked it up before bed. It was 45 minutes away in a suburb I'd never had reason to visit. The rooms were small. The reviews were middling. The monthly cost was $4,200, which, if you were a person who had just looked up how much a house on Elm Creek Road was worth in the current Tucson market, and I had, also before bed, told a very clear story about who would benefit from the arithmetic. My house had been appraised the previous year for $410,000. Harold and I had paid it off in 2001. There was no mortgage. There was no lien. The house was mine, free and clear, and had been for 22 years, $410,000. Divided by 2. I lay there in the dark, and I did the math my children had already done, and I felt something shift inside me. Not collapse, not despair. Something harder than that, and colder, and more useful. Fear came first, though. I won't pretend otherwise. I was a 74-year-old widow living alone, and my children had lawyers. I was certain of that because Daniel does not make moves without lawyers. And I had spent 51 years being a mother and a wife and a gardener and a reader of books, not a litigant. The legal system was not my native country. But then I thought about Harold. Harold was a quiet man, but he was not a passive one. He used to say, "The person who prepares wins more arguments than the person who is right." He'd said it about business negotiations, about difficult neighbors, about the time our insurance company tried to underpay a roof claim, and he'd spent 6 weeks documenting every conversation until they capitulated. Preparation. Documentation. That was Harold's language. I got up at 5:30 in the morning and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had laid down that folder, and I opened a notebook. I wrote down everything I could remember from the previous 6 months. Every visit. Every question about my health. Every photograph Linda had taken. The dates as precisely as I could recall them. The exact words Daniel had used. We've been talking. We think it might be time. Starting a conversation. The way Cheryl had walked through the living room with her eyes moving over the furniture. Then I wrote down what I knew about myself. I was in good health. My doctor, Patricia Huang, at the Rincon Medical Group, had cleared me at my annual physical 8 months ago. Blood pressure normal, cognition sharp, no balance issues, no fall history. I drove, I cooked, I managed my own finances. I had not, in recent memory, left the stove on or missed a bill or gotten lost in a place I knew. I had a will, drawn up in 2020, which left the house to Daniel and Linda in equal shares upon my death. That was no longer a document I felt comfortable leaving unexamined. I called my book club friend Connie that morning. Connie Abernethy had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired, and she had the kind of practical legal knowledge that is more useful than theory. I told her what had happened. There was a long pause on her end. "Margaret," she said, "you need a real estate attorney and an elder law attorney, and you need them before your kids make their next move." "I know," I said, "and you need to protect that deed." I didn't know exactly what she meant by that yet, but I wrote it down. That afternoon, I drove to the public library. I still preferred to research in quiet spaces, away from the house where I was increasingly aware that my children might have keys. And I spent 3 hours reading about guardianship proceedings, conservatorship, and what in the state of Arizona constituted grounds for challenging a senior's right to independent living. What I found was sobering and clarifying in equal measure. To remove a person's legal autonomy in Arizona, a petitioner must demonstrate that the person is incapacitated, unable to manage their own affairs due to a mental or physical condition. The standard requires medical evidence. It requires a court appointment. It is not, in theory, easy to obtain without genuine cause. In theory, but I also read the case studies. I read about families who had coached physicians, hired compliant evaluators, and presented selectively edited evidence to overworked probate judges. I read about elderly people who had walked into courtrooms independent and walked out legally stripped of their own decisions. I closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the library's quiet. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh page and I wrote at the top, my plan. It was going to take time. It was going to take money. It was going to require me to be patient and precise and absolutely, relentlessly prepared. I was 74 years old, and I had been underestimated my entire life. I was about to stop allowing it. The first call I made was to an attorney named Robert Castillo. Connie had given me his name. She'd worked with him years ago on an estate case and described him as thorough, unhurried, and not given to false reassurance, which was exactly what I needed. His office was on the east side of Tucson, in a low building surrounded by mesquite trees, the kind of place that didn't advertise on billboards. I liked that. I told him everything. The folder on the table, the unannounced visits, the photographs, the brochure, the conversations about my health that had never once asked how I felt, only whether I was capable. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and then he asked me very specific questions. Did I have a copy of my current will? Was the deed to the property solely in my name? Had I signed any documents for my children, powers of attorney, healthcare proxies, anything at all, in the past 3 years? I had signed nothing. He nodded slowly. That's good. That's actually your first line of defense. They have no current legal authority over you or your affairs. Can they get it? They can try to petition the court for guardianship or conservatorship. That's what this is building toward, in my assessment. They'd need to demonstrate incapacity. He paused. Have you had a recent medical evaluation? I had. I told him about Dr. Huang. He asked me to request a copy of the records from that visit, specifically the cognitive screening results. He also recommended I schedule a new evaluation, comprehensive, including neuropsychological testing, with a specialist he trusted, so that I had an independent, current, and thorough document of my mental and physical capacity. Not because there was anything wrong with me, he said, but because in a courtroom, documentation beats testimony every time. I left his office with a list of 4 action items and a retainer agreement. I wrote a check without hesitation. This was not the time to weigh costs. The neuropsychological evaluation was scheduled for the following week at a clinic near the university. I drove myself there and spent 2.5 hours being tested on memory, attention, reasoning, processing speed, and executive function. The psychologist, a calm woman named Dr. Reyes, told me at the end of the session that my scores placed me in the above-average range for my age group across all domains. I thanked her. I asked for the report in writing as soon as possible. It was during this same week that I noticed the first sign that Daniel and Linda were paying attention. Linda called on a Tuesday evening. Nothing unusual in that. But the questions were different. She asked if I'd talked to anyone about the conversation we'd had at the house. She asked it casually, the way you ask something when you're hoping the answer is no. I told her I'd spoken with Connie, which was true, and mentioned nothing about Robert Castillo. There was a pause. Connie Abernethy? Why? She's my friend, I said. I talked to her. Another pause. Mom, we're just trying to help. We don't want this to become adversarial. The word adversarial told me everything. You don't use that word unless you've already been thinking in legal terms. The second sign came 3 days later, when I discovered that Linda had spoken to my neighbor, Patricia Walsh, asking whether she'd noticed anything concerning about my behavior recently. Patricia told me this herself, standing at my back fence with a look of uncomfortable apology on her face. She said Linda had implied she was asking on behalf of the family, and had asked specifically about whether I'd left the garage door open overnight, whether I seemed forgetful, whether I'd had any visitors she didn't recognize. Patricia had told Linda she had no concerns. She told me she thought the whole thing was odd. I thanked her and went inside and sat down at my kitchen table and wrote it all in my notebook. Date, time, what was said, who witnessed it. The systematic questioning of my neighbors was not the behavior of people having a casual conversation. It was the behavior of people building a record. The third, and most important, sign came at the end of that week. I had requested a copy of the deed to the house from the Pima County Recorder's Office, simply to have it in hand and to verify its current status. The clerk's office sent me a printout showing the current title history. Everything was in order. The deed was in my name alone, as it had been since Harold's death, when it transferred to me under the right of survivorship we had established decades ago. But there was also a notation I did not recognize. A title search had been run on the property 6 weeks earlier. Not by me. Not by any bank or lender I recognized. By a law firm in Phoenix, Hartwell and Briggs, LLP. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I called Robert Castillo. "That's Daniel's attorney," I said, reading him the firm name. "Yes," he said. "It is." A brief pause. "Margaret, they've already started." I already knew that. But hearing it said plainly by a man whose job it was to know what things meant made it real in a different way. This was no longer a conversation about a brochure on a kitchen table. This was a lawsuit in the making, and I had just found the first piece of evidence that proved it. Robert Castillo moved quickly after the title search discovery. Within 10 days, he had filed a quiet title action on my behalf. A legal proceeding that formally established the property as solely mine and put any future claim to it on record with the court. He also drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Hartwell and Briggs, informing them that I was legally represented, that any further attempts to investigate or encumber my property without my consent would be challenged, and that I was documenting all contact. He sent a copy to Daniel. I would like to tell you that I felt triumphant when he told me this. What I actually felt was tired and then resolved, and then something close to sad. The specific sadness of a person who hoped, even at this late stage, that she had misread the situation, that the title search had an innocent explanation, that her son would call and say there had been a misunderstanding. Daniel called on a Thursday evening. It was not the call I had hoped for. "You hired a lawyer." His voice was controlled. He was not shouting, which was more unnerving than if he had been. "Without telling us, without even giving us a chance to explain." "Explain what, Daniel?" "The title search was just research. We were looking into options for estate planning, for after..." He stopped. "For after I die? For after you're no longer able to manage things independently, which is going to happen, Mom. That's just reality." "It hasn't happened yet," I said, "and until it does, my house is my house." There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to hear him breathing. Then, "You're making this very difficult." I said nothing. "We're your family. We're trying to protect you." "From what?" I asked. "From living in my own home?" He hung up. Linda came to the house 2 days later. She did not knock. She had a key, which I had given her years ago for emergencies, and which I had not yet thought to change. And I heard the front door open while I was in the kitchen. She came in and sat down across from me, and for a moment she simply looked at me the way you look at a problem you're calculating. "Daniel is very upset," she said. "I imagine he is. Mom, do you understand what you're doing? You filed legal papers against your own family. Do you know how that looks?" "I know exactly how it looks," I said. "It looks like a woman protecting her home." Linda's composure cracked slightly. Not much. but enough. We have documentation, you know. We've been keeping records. You left the stove on in February. You forgot Ruth's birthday. You told me the same story about your doctor's appointment 3 times in 1 week. I set down my coffee cup. I left a burner on low while I went to the back garden for 10 minutes. Ruth's birthday is in March, and I sent her a card on the 5th. And yes, I told you about the appointment more than once because you seemed distracted and I wasn't sure you'd heard me. She blinked. I have been keeping records too, I said quietly, since March of last year. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Linda stood up. You're going to regret this. Daniel has resources. He has a very good attorney, and he knows how to... She stopped herself. How to what? I asked. She left without answering. That night, Daniel called again, and this time his voice was different, tighter, and with an undertone of something I recognized from his adolescence, the particular register he used when he knew he was losing an argument, but hadn't accepted it yet. We've consulted with our attorney, he said. We're filing a petition for guardianship. Voluntary or not, this is happening. And if you fight it, it's going to be expensive and public, and you're going to end up looking unstable in front of a judge. I let him finish. I have a neuropsychological evaluation completed last week, showing full cognitive capacity, I said. I have a primary care physician who will testify to my physical health. I have documented every interaction we've had for the past year, including this phone call, which I should mention I began recording when you started speaking. Another silence. Good night, Daniel, I said, and I hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The house was quiet. The oak tree in the backyard moved slowly in the evening wind. I thought about Harold, the way I often did when things were difficult. Not with longing, exactly, but with a kind of consultation, as if I could still ask him whether I was handling this right. I thought he'd say I was. I took 3 days after that. I put the notebook in the drawer. I went to book club. I had dinner with Connie and Ruth, and we did not discuss the case at all. I let myself sit in the garden in the late afternoon warmth and watch the birds at the feeder Harold had installed the year before he got sick. I was going to need my strength for what came next, and I intended to have it. The offer came on a Monday. Daniel called. Not in the evening this time, but mid-morning, which felt calculated, as if he expected me to be more receptive in daylight, less guarded. His tone had changed again. It was warmer now, conciliatory. The voice of a man who had decided, on advice of counsel or by his own instinct, that confrontation had not worked, and charm was the next instrument to try. Mom, he said, I owe you an apology. I waited. I think we went about this the wrong way. Cheryl and I talked it over, and we were too heavy-handed. We scared you instead of including you. That was wrong. A pause, perfectly timed. What we want is for you to be happy and safe. That's all we've ever wanted. I appreciate you saying that, I said. We'd like to put a proposal on the table, something that works for everyone. He explained it carefully, in the organized way he explained things when he had rehearsed them. The proposal was this. I would sell the house voluntarily and use the proceeds to fund my own care at a facility of my choosing. Any amount left over, if there was any after care costs, which he was careful to note could be substantial, would be preserved in a trust for my benefit. The house would be sold. The money would go into a structure controlled by others. I would live somewhere chosen for me. It was dressed up differently than the original plan, but it was the same plan. I'll think about it, I said. Of course. Take all the time you need. There's no rush. There was a rush, and we both knew it, but I let the sentence sit there. After I hung up, I called Robert Castillo and told him about the offer. He was unsurprised. This is what they do when the legal path looks uncertain, he said. They try to get you to agree voluntarily to what they couldn't force. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything in writing or verbally. I know, I said. Do you want me to respond formally on your behalf? Not yet, I said. I want to watch a little longer. What I want to tell you about that period, those quiet weeks in the spring, is that I was not suffering. I know that might be surprising. I was in a legal dispute with my children. I was navigating paperwork and attorney calls and the low hum of anxiety that comes with contested proceedings, and yet I was not, fundamentally, unhappy. The house was still mine. The garden was coming in well. The hummingbirds had found the new feeder I'd put up near the patio. And I was, for the first time in years, not lonely. The case had done something unexpected. It had brought people toward me. Connie had become my daily phone call. And in those conversations, I was reminded of why we had been friends for 25 years. Her frankness, her humor, the way she never softened things that didn't need softening. Ruth had quietly, without being asked, begun keeping notes of our Thursday meetings, recording who was present and what was discussed, because she understood, with the instinct of a former schoolteacher, that documentation of my engagement and lucidity was useful. Beverly had offered her guest room if I ever felt I needed to be somewhere other than the house for a night. I had also, unexpectedly, acquired an ally at the county recorder's office, a clerk named Thomas, who had processed my quiet title paperwork and, recognizing what it was, had mentioned that this type of filing had become more common in recent years and that there were advocacy resources available. He'd handed me a card for an organization called the Arizona Elder Rights Project, which provided legal and social support for older adults facing exactly this kind of family-based pressure. I called them the following Tuesday. The advocate I spoke with was a woman named Sandra Flores, 40-something, direct, with the cadence of someone who had heard many versions of this story. She listened to mine. She told me I had done nearly everything right, and that the one gap was a formal supportive network on record. Not just an attorney, but documentation of my social engagement, my community, my ongoing activities, that would demonstrate to any judge that I was a participant in the world, not an isolated elder in decline. We built a list together. Book club attendance. Ruth's notes would cover that. Regular attendance at First Lutheran, where I had been a member since 1987. The church secretary confirmed she could provide a letter. My library card history, which showed consistent borrowing. My volunteer work at the literacy program at the branch library, 2 hours every Wednesday, which the program coordinator was glad to document. I was not invisible. I was not diminished. I was not a woman waiting to be managed. I was a woman with a life, and I was going to prove it. They came together on a Saturday in April. I saw Daniel's rental car. He always rented in Tucson, a habit from business travel that he'd never dropped, pull into the driveway at 11 in the morning. Linda's Subaru was right behind it. They had coordinated, which meant this visit was not spontaneous, which meant it had been planned, which meant it had a purpose that had nothing to do with coffee and conversation. I let them in. I was not going to hide in my own home. Cheryl had not come, which was notable. This was a family conversation, stripped to the principles. Daniel looked tired. The composed efficiency that usually defined him was slightly worn, like a suit that had been slept in. Linda had brought a casserole dish, which she carried with both hands as if the offering of food could soften what was coming. We sat in the living room. I served coffee. We talked about the grandchildren for 12 minutes, which I know because I was watching the clock on the mantel, and which felt like a runway, not a conversation. Daniel asked about the oldest boy's baseball season. Linda mentioned that her middle child had started piano lessons. I answered each question with genuine warmth, because whatever had passed between us legally, those were still my grandchildren, and I still loved them without reservation. But I kept one part of my attention on the room, on the pacing, on the fact that neither of them had driven hours or across town for small talk. Then Daniel set down his cup. "We want to start over," he said. He explained at length what a new beginning might look like. He had a way of describing things that made them sound reasonable and warm, while the structure underneath remained entirely unchanged. The new version of the plan involved me staying in the house temporarily, 6 months, perhaps a year, while we worked together to plan the transition. He would visit more. Linda would help with maintenance. We would tour facilities together as a family so I could feel involved in the decision. "And the legal proceedings?" I asked. "We'd drop them, all of it. A clean slate." He said it easily, as if this were the generous offer, not the removal of a threat he had created. Linda leaned forward. "Mom, think about what you're putting us through. We're your children. We love you. Doesn't that matter?" And there it was, the card that was always going to be played. Love as the argument for surrender. Family as the reason I should let go of the thing that was mine. I looked at my daughter. At the casserole she'd brought. At the careful distress on her face. At the effort she was making to look like a daughter rather than a petitioner. And I thought about all the years I had believed that her sharpness was a shell, and her softness was the truth. I was no longer certain which was which. "It matters very much," I said, "which is why I'm not going to pretend this conversation is about love." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You ran a title search on my property," I said. "You hired attorneys before you sat down at that table with a brochure. You questioned my neighbors. You compiled a list of my supposed failures to use as legal evidence." I paused. "That's not what love looks like. That's what a case being built looks like." Linda's eyes filled with tears. Genuine or performed, I couldn't fully say, and I found that I had stopped trying to parse the difference. "We were scared," she said. "We didn't handle it right. We got ahead of ourselves." "Maybe," I said, "but you're still here today, asking me to agree to a timeline for leaving my home. The framing is kinder. The destination is the same." Daniel shifted in his chair. He tried a different approach then, the appeal to practicality, which was always his strongest instrument. He talked about maintenance costs, about the roof that would need replacing in a few years, about the yard and whether I could realistically manage it alone. Every sentence was constructed to sound like concern and land like doubt. He was planting seeds, one by one, into the conversation, hoping something would take root. I listened. I did not interrupt. I let each sentence finish. And then I said, "I have a contractor I trust for the roof. I have a yard service I can hire for the heavy work. I have a savings account that can cover both." I folded my hands. I have thought about all of this. I have lived here for 51 years. Did either of you imagine I hadn't thought about it? What? The room went quiet in a way that answered my question. Daniel stood up. The warmth was gone now. Not replaced by anger, exactly, but by a kind of flat assessment that was, in some ways, worse. He looked at me the way he looked at a deal that had failed to close. "You're going to spend everything you have on lawyers," he said, "and at the end of it, you'll be alone here, and we'll be estranged, and nothing will have changed, except that we can't be there for you anymore." "You are not there for me," I said quietly. "You are there for the house." He walked to the door. Linda followed, setting the casserole on the entry table with a small, controlled motion that was somehow more communicative than anything she'd said. At the door, Daniel turned. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," I said. They left. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a long moment. The house was quiet around me. the familiar quiet of a place that knows you, the creak of the boards under my feet, the light through the east window making its usual late morning pattern on the floor. I was shaking slightly, I realized. Not with fear, exactly, though fear was part of it. The fear was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. My children had resources I didn't have: Daniel's money, Hartwell and Briggs, the ability to sustain a legal fight for longer than most people could withstand. I thought about what it would mean to lose. Not just the house, though that was enormous, but the right to remain myself. The right to wake up in my own bedroom and make my own coffee and tend my own garden and decide each day how I wanted to spend the hours I had left. That was what was actually at stake. Not square footage, not property values. The right to be a person rather than a problem to be managed. The fear moved through me, and it left something behind. I went to my desk and I opened the notebook. I was ready. The hearing was set for a Thursday in June. The Pima County Superior Court, Probate Division, Courtroom 4C. I drove myself there, which I mention not as a point of pride, but because it was noted in the record, noted by Robert Castillo as part of the day's proceedings, a detail that would matter later. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had seen courtrooms in films and on television, those high-ceilinged chambers that make everything feel like history. This was a working room, fluorescent light, institutional carpet, a gallery of plastic chairs. Daniel and Linda sat with their attorney, a man named Warren Blythe from Hartwell and Briggs, compact, silver-haired, with the air of someone who had won enough cases to find them slightly tedious. He glanced at me when I came in and looked back at his papers. I heard, later from Robert, that Blythe had said to Daniel before I arrived, "She has no chance. We have the documentation, we have the pattern, and elderly plaintiffs without family support don't tend to perform well under examination." The phrase that was repeated to me was, "She has no chance." I filed it away with the other things I knew. Judge Margaret Okafor was 60-something, deliberate, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular patience of someone who has seen many people attempt to use her courtroom as a substitute for conversations they should have had at home. Blythe presented first. He was good. I will give him that. He had assembled the documentation with care. The incidents Linda had recorded, the observations from those early months, statements from two of Daniel's contacts, a geriatric care manager who had evaluated me not at my request or my doctor's referral, but at Daniel's arrangement, through a process I had not been informed of and had not consented to. The care manager's report was 3 months old and described, on the basis of a 40-minute in-home visit in which I had cooperated pleasantly and answered all questions correctly, a person who was showing early indicators of social isolation and executive decline. Robert objected to the admissibility of that report. The judge reserved her ruling. Blythe concluded with something that would have been effective if I were the person he thought I was. A recounting, delivered with practiced sorrow, of 2 devoted children struggling to help a mother who had become, in her grief and her stubbornness, unable to see that she needed help. He described Daniel as a concerned son who had watched his mother grow increasingly isolated since his father's death. He described Linda as a devoted daughter living nearby, doing her best to maintain a connection that her mother seemed determined to sever. It was a portrait of a family at the end of its patience, rendered in sympathetic tones. I noticed that several of the factual details were technically accurate and entirely misleading, which is a specific skill that requires considerable practice. It was a good performance. Robert's presentation was different, methodical. He did not perform. He entered the neuropsychological evaluation from Dr. Reyes. He entered the clearance from Dr. Huang. He entered the letters from First Lutheran, the literacy program, the library. He entered Ruth's meticulous book club records, 14 meetings attended in 18 months, active participation documented in Ruth's schoolteacher handwriting. He entered the deed, the quiet title filing, and the record of the title search run by Hartwell and Briggs 6 weeks before I had been shown any brochure or had any conversation with my children about my future. That last item landed visibly. Judge Okafor looked at it for a longer moment than she looked at most documents. Then it was my turn. I was not required to speak. Robert had told me that, from the beginning, the burden of proof was on Daniel and Linda. I did not have to take the stand. But I had decided, weeks earlier, sitting in my kitchen with the notebook open in front of me, that I wanted to. Not for the judge, for myself. Because I had spent 18 months being discussed, evaluated, documented, and assessed by people who had never once asked me directly what I wanted. I wanted to speak in my own voice, in my own words, on the record. I walked to the stand. I sat. I folded my hands. Blythe approached. He was courteous. The professional courtesy of a man who is certain he is about to win. He asked me about my daily routine. I answered clearly. He asked about my finances. I described my accounts, my investment statements, my system for tracking household expenses, which I had maintained in a paper ledger since 1989. He asked whether I had any difficulty managing complex tasks. I told him I had prepared my own taxes for 42 years. He asked whether I felt capable of making major decisions independently. And here I want to tell you about the 3 words. Because what you might imagine, something dramatic, a revelation, a speech, is not what happened. What happened was this. Blythe asked the question, and I looked at him steadily, and I said, quite quietly, I already have. He paused. I'm sorry? I already have made major decisions independently, I said. I retained an attorney. I commissioned a neuropsychological evaluation. I filed a quiet title action. I gathered documentation of my medical history, my cognitive function, my social engagement, and my financial management, and I presented it to this court. I paused. I did all of that without assistance from my children, without guidance from anyone who stood to benefit from my decisions, and without anyone's permission. Another pause. I believe that answers your question. The gallery was very quiet. Judge Okafor had set down her pen. I saw her look not at Blythe, not at Daniel, but at the folder of documents on her desk, as if she were rechecking something she had already concluded. Her papers shifted in her hands, and one slipped to the desk with a soft sound that, in that silence, carried across the whole room. I saw Daniel at the table to my left, and for the first time in this entire proceeding, he looked like what he was, a man who had not prepared for the possibility of losing. Blythe attempted to continue. He asked about the burned burner, the missed birthday. I addressed both, calmly, with the dates and context I had recorded. He asked about my son's concern for my well-being. I said I had no doubt my son had concerns, and that I hoped he would have the opportunity to express them in a setting that didn't involve attempting to remove my legal autonomy. Blythe glanced back at Daniel once, a brief, involuntary look, and in that glance I saw the first crack in his composure. He had been told this would be straightforward. He was recalculating. Judge Okafor removed her glasses. Judge Okafor spoke for 11 minutes. I know the exact duration because Robert timed it. He told me afterward, the way you note a detail that feels important even before you know why. 11 minutes without interruption, in a voice that was even and cool and left no ambiguity about what she had found or what she intended to do about it. She began with the petition itself. She found it insufficient. The medical evidence presented by the petitioners, Daniel and Linda, relied primarily on a single evaluation conducted without my consent or prior notice by a care manager retained and paid for by the petitioner based on a single brief home visit. She contrasted this with the evidence I had presented: a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation by a licensed clinical psychologist at an accredited institution, a physician's statement from my primary care doctor of 9 years, and a substantial record of community engagement, social activity, and independent financial management. The standard for guardianship in the state of Arizona, she said, is not inconvenience. It is not the existence of a more efficient arrangement. It is not the preference of family members for outcomes that benefit them financially. She paused, looking briefly toward the petitioner's table. This court must find that the respondent is incapacitated. I do not find that. She turned to the title search. Here her voice did not change in volume, but something in its quality shifted. A slight hardening, the tone of a person who is about to say something that needs to be said without softening. The record shows that a title search was conducted on the respondent's property by counsel for the petitioners approximately 6 weeks before any conversation was had with the respondent about her living situation or care needs. This court finds that timeline significant. It suggests that the petitioner's concern was not primarily with the respondent's welfare, but with the disposition of her assets. I heard Blythe murmur something to Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Linda, beside him, had her hands folded tightly in her lap and was looking at the table. I watched her absorb each sentence the way you watch someone absorb rain. She could not stop it, and she had stopped trying. The petition for guardianship is denied, Judge Okafor said. The petition for conservatorship is denied. The respondent retains full legal authority over her person and her property. She looked down at a document in front of her. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of the care manager's report to the state licensing board, given concerns about the circumstances of its preparation. Counsel for the petitioners is advised to review the ethical guidelines governing communications with unrepresented parties. That last sentence was directed at Blythe. He kept his expression neutral, but the hand resting on the table in front of him pressed slightly flatter against the surface. An involuntary stillness, the physical equivalent of catching yourself. I had watched enough people absorb bad news to recognize the reflex. He had not expected the referral. That was not a consequence he had priced into his calculation when he took this case. I looked at Daniel. He was sitting very straight. The composure was intact, the way a wall is intact after the mortar has already started to fail. Holding the shape, but changed underneath. He was a man who had been certain, completely and professionally certain, and who was now sitting in a courtroom that had just declared him wrong in writing, on the record, in language that would be available to any attorney who searched his name in connection with elder law proceedings. I do not know what he was thinking, but I know what certainty looks like when it breaks quietly, and I was watching it. Then she looked at me directly, which judges do not always do. "Miss Calloway," she said. Calloway was Harold's name, and mine, and the name on the deed. This court finds no basis to disturb your independence. Your home is your home. I had promised myself I would not cry in that courtroom. I didn't, but it was close. Outside, in the corridor, Robert shook my hand with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done his job precisely as it needed to be done. I thanked him, not effusively, because he would not have wanted that, but genuinely. He had been worth every dollar of the retainer. Daniel and Linda came out of the courtroom behind us. Daniel looked as he always looked after a failed negotiation, composed, contained, already calculating the next move. but there was something different underneath it. Something that didn't quite have a name, but that I recognized as the specific look of a person who had been certain of something and had been wrong. Not just legally wrong. Wrong about me. Wrong about who I was and what I was capable of and what I would do when it mattered. He had looked at me for 51 years and seen a mother, which is to say, someone whose existence was organized around his. He had not seen a person who had been quietly keeping records for 18 months and building a case with the thoroughness of a woman who had nothing to lose by being precise. Linda looked like she had been crying. Her sunglasses were already on, though we were still inside, which told me she had put them on before we reached the corridor. I stood in the courthouse hallway, and I waited to see if either of them would speak to me. Daniel walked past without making eye contact. Linda stopped. For a long moment, she stood there, and I thought she might say something. Apologize, perhaps, or explain, or simply acknowledge that something significant had passed between us that could not be undone by a casserole or a carefully rehearsed appeal to family. She didn't. She put on her sunglasses and walked toward the elevator. I watched them go. I felt no triumph. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something quieter. A settledness, like a door that has been left ajar for a long time, finally closing properly in its frame. Then I walked out of the Pima County Courthouse and into the June morning, which was bright and already hot in the way of Tucson summers, with the smell of creosote in the dry air and the sky a hard, cloudless blue overhead. I sat in my car for a few minutes, not from distress, from stillness, the particular stillness of a thing that is over. Then I drove home, to my house, on Elm Creek Road. With the oak tree Harold and I planted the year Daniel was born, and the yellow kitchen, and the pencil marks on the doorframe, and the third stair that creaks, mine. The summer after the hearing was the best summer I had had in years. The garden came in better than it had since before Harold got sick. I planted tomatoes along the south fence and put in a new bed of salvia near the patio. I had coffee on the back steps in the morning and watched the hummingbirds with a quietness I hadn't been able to find in a long time. The book club continued. We had added a fifth member, a woman named Diane, who had recently retired from teaching high school English and had opinions about everything, which suited us perfectly. We laughed more that summer than I remembered laughing in years. I continued my Wednesday volunteer work at the literacy program. One of my students, a man named Hector, 53 years old, learning to read for the first time, passed his first evaluation in September and shook my hand with a formality that undid me completely. I made a change to my will. Robert helped me draft it. The house, upon my death, would go to the Southern Arizona Land Trust, which preserves open desert and working agricultural land. Daniel and Linda were not excluded entirely. I am not a cruel woman, but they were no longer the primary beneficiaries of the property. I sent them each a letter informing them of this, not to cause pain, because they deserved to know. Neither of them responded. I heard, through the ordinary channels of a life lived in a community, how things went for them afterward. Daniel's business had a difficult year. He and Cheryl listed their Phoenix house for sale in October and moved to a smaller place in Scottsdale. Linda's situation was harder to hear about because it was sadder. Greg had still not found consistent work. The children were struggling. I thought about my grandchildren more than I thought about Linda and Greg. Children absorb what surrounds them. Linda called me once in November. She asked if I was well. I said I was. She asked about the garden. I told her about the salvia and the tomatoes. There was a pause. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. No elaboration, no defense. "I know," I said, and I meant it. I am not a person who requires groveling. What I required, and what I had obtained, was my autonomy. My right to be the author of my own life, in my own home, for whatever time I have remaining. In December, I had the oak tree properly trimmed for the first time since Harold died. The arborist told me it was in excellent health and would outlast both of us by a century. I made my coffee. I sat in the garden in the winter light. I thought, I'm still here, and I was glad. So that is my story. A house, 2 children, and 1 woman who refused to be erased quietly. What I learned is this: preparation is not stubbornness, it is dignity. Document everything. Know your rights. Find the people who will stand beside you. And when someone tells you that you have no chance, that is precisely the moment to prove them wrong. What would you have done in my place? Would you have signed those papers and walked away? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for staying until the end.